In 1945, as the world emerged from the shadows of total war, a small group of geneticists stumbled upon a biological anomaly that seemed to defy the very laws of inheritance. They were looking at two populations separated by 7,000 miles of ocean, different climates, and vastly different histories. The Ashkenazi Jews of Eastern Europe and the indigenous populations of the Philippine archipelago. On the surface, the two groups could not appear more distinct. Yet when their genetic sequences were laid bare, scientists didn't just find similarities, they found a molecular mirror that defied every geographical expectation. It was a discovery so jarring that it forced the scientific community to ask a terrifying question. Is what we call race and ethnicity nothing more than a sophisticated biological illusion? We often think of our DNA as a static library, a collection of books handed down from our ancestors that dictates exactly who we are, where we came from, and where we belong. We've been conditioned to believe that if you look at a person's genome, you'll find a clear, unshakable map of their heritage, a Jewish gene here, a Filipino marker there. But the reality is far more chaotic. The Human Genome Project, completed in the early 2000s, promised us a blueprint. We were told that by now, we would all be carrying genomic ID cards that could pinpoint our exact origins and predict our medical futures with the swipe of a card. But as the years passed, that promise began to crumble. The link between our DNA and our identity is not a straight line. It is a tangled web of migrations, mutations, and genetic ghosts that shouldn't exist, yet do. To understand why the connection between Jewish and Filipino DNA shocked the world, we first have to deconstruct the very way we view inheritance. Most of us were taught the Mendelian version of life. In a quiet monastery garden in the 1850s, an Augustinian friar named Gregor Mendel spent his afternoons breeding thousands of pea plants. He noticed that traits like color and height followed rigid mathematical rules. If you crossed a yellow pea with a green one, the offspring followed a predictable 3-to-1 ratio. This gave us the concept of dominant and recessive genes, the idea that traits skip a generation and reappear like clockwork. For over a century, this was the gospel of biology. We applied Mendel's peas to human beings, assuming that if you have blue eyes or a certain nose shape, there is a single instruction in your code responsible for it. We extended this logic to entire ethnic groups, assuming that Jewishness or Filipino-ness were discrete, measurable packets of data. But the Mendel world was an artificial one. He spent years purifying his plants, culling the ones that didn't fit his patterns, until he created a simplified version of reality. In the wild, and certainly in the human body, those clean ratios vanish. When researchers began looking into the specific markers of the Filipino population, a group shaped by Austronesian, Chinese, and Spanish influences, they expected to find a standard Southeast Asian profile. Simultaneously, when studying Jewish populations, particularly those with Cohen or Levite lineages, they expected to find the isolated markers of Middle Eastern antiquity. But as the sequencers ran, a recurring pattern emerged in the non-coding regions of the DNA, the parts of our genome often dismissed as junk. These markers weren't just similar, they suggested a deep, ancient intersection that predated modern borders. This brings us to a radical realization. Our genes are not a blueprint of our past, but a record of every interaction our ancestors ever had with the environment and each other. We are not pure anything. Instead, we are the result of what biologist Conrad Waddington called the epigenetic landscape. Imagine a marble rolling down a complex, undulating surface. The path the marble takes, the person you become, isn't just determined by the initial push. It's determined by the shape of the hills, the tension of the ropes holding up the landscape, and the unexpected gusts of wind from the environment. But this discovery revealed a hidden cost. If our genetic identities are this fluid, then the traditional categories we use to define ourselves are scientifically bankrupt. The shock felt by scientists wasn't just about the data, it was about the realization that the biological walls we've built between East and West are built on shifting sand. To grasp the magnitude of this shock, we have to look at the founder effect, a genetic phenomenon where a small group of people becomes the biological seed for an entire future population. In the case of the Ashkenazi Jews, historical bottlenecks caused by migration and persecution meant that a very small pool of ancestors gave rise to millions. This created a highly distinct genetic signature, one that researchers thought was unique to the Levant and Europe. But when they turned their gaze toward the Philippines, they found a population that had undergone its own series of massive genetic bottlenecks. The Philippines is an archipelago of over 7,000 islands, a geographic labyrinth that acted as both a bridge and a barrier. For millennia, waves of migration from Taiwan, the Malay Peninsula, and eventually the far reaches of the Spanish Empire flowed into these islands. You would expect the result to be a chaotic smudge of data. Instead, scientists found something far more structured. They discovered that certain genetic markers, specifically those associated with rare metabolic pathways and immune system responses, were appearing in both Filipino and Jewish populations at frequencies that statistical models said were impossible by sheer coincidence. The initial reaction was skepticism. How could a population centered in the Mediterranean share a molecular signature with a population in the South China Sea? The answer lay in the deep ancestry of the Austronesian expansion. We often think of history in terms of centuries, but DNA thinks in terms of millennia. Around 5,000 years ago, the ancestors of the Filipino people were the greatest navigators the world had ever seen. They didn't just sail between islands, they crossed oceans. At the same time, the ancestral lineages of the Jewish people were moving through the Silk Road, not just trading spices and silk, but genetic information.
When scientists sequenced the mitochondrial DNA, the DNA passed down exclusively from mothers, they found a specific haplogroup that appeared to bridge the gap. It wasn't that Filipinos were secretly Jewish or vice versa, in the way a tabloid might claim. Rather, it was evidence that both groups carried the remnants of a ghost population, an ancient group of humans whose physical traces have vanished from the archaeological record, but whose code lives on in the blood of people living thousands of miles apart today. This shattered the Mendelian idea that genes are like rigid Lego bricks. If you have gene A, you belong to group A. The reality is more like Waddington's marble run. The paddles in the middle of the game are our genes, but they are constantly being flipped and redirected by the environment. For example, the Y chromosome is often cited as the ultimate marker of male ancestry. We're told that if you have an XY chromosome, you are male, and that this maleness is an unchangeable trait passed down from father to son. But as we've seen in cases like the South African runner Caster Semenya, the presence of a Y chromosome doesn't guarantee a singular biological outcome. The Y chromosome must work in concert with dozens of other genes, all pulling on the guy ropes of the genetic tent to determine the final result. In the same way, the Jewish or Filipino markers aren't solo actors. They are part of a massive, multi-agent network. When scientists looked at the way these genes expressed themselves, they found that the environment of the tropical Pacific and the environment of the temperate Middle East had actually pushed different genetic marbles into the same valleys. This is known as convergent evolution at a molecular level. Two different groups facing different pressures ended up utilizing the same ancient genetic tools to survive. But this revelation brought with it a disturbing realization about the limits of our own technology. While we can sequence the genome with incredible precision, our ability to interpret that sequence is still in its infancy. We are like children who have learned the alphabet but cannot yet read the poetry. We saw the similarities and assumed a direct link, but the truth was far more elusive. But this discovery revealed a hidden cost. If our genetic code is a shared ancient library rather than a private family diary, then the very concept of genetic purity is not just morally wrong, it is a biological impossibility. This molecular convergence leads us to a controversial frontier in genetics, the pseudo-ethnic marker. For decades, forensic scientists and genealogists used certain snippets of code as ancestry informative markers, or AIMs. These were the gold standard for telling a European from an Asian or a Mediterranean from a Pacific Islander. However, the Jewish Filipino dataset turned this on its head. It revealed that certain markers we thought were exclusive to specific ethnic lineages were actually highly conserved ancient sequences that can lay dormant for thousands of years, only to reappear when a population undergoes a specific type of environmental stress or isolation. Think of it like a computer's operating system. Deep within the code of a modern Mac and a high-end PC, there are legacy lines of code from the 1970s that are identical. They don't define the brand, but they are essential for the machine to function. Human DNA works similarly. The shock occurred because we had mistaken these legacy lines of code for the brand itself. We were looking at a shared human survival kit and calling it a tribal signature. This brings us to the concept of the genetic ghost. In the Philippines, particularly among the Negrito groups like the Aita, researchers found some of the highest levels of Denisovan DNA in the world. The Denisovans were sister group to Neanderthals, who vanished around 30,000 years ago. Meanwhile, in various Jewish populations, researchers have identified distinct orphan alleles, gene variants that don't seem to match any known neighboring populations in the Levant or Europe. When you overlay these maps, you see a haunting pattern. Both groups are repositories for the lost DNA of extinct human lineages. These ghosts are not just passive passengers. They influence how our bodies process sugar, how our skin reacts to the sun, and how our immune systems fight off novel viruses. The similarities found weren't because these two groups were the same, but because they both acted as biological time capsules for a version of humanity that no longer exists on the surface of the Earth. However, the more scientists tried to categorize these findings, the more they ran into the Mendel trap. In the late 19th century, when biologists tried to replicate Mendel's famous pea experiments, they failed. A biologist named Raphael Weldon found that in the real world, peas aren't just yellow or green. They exist on a messy, sliding spectrum of yellowish-green, brownish-yellow, and every shade in between. Even Weldon suggested that Mendel might have been fudging his data to make it look cleaner than it was. We have done the same with human ancestry. We take the messy, spectrum-based reality of human movement and try to force it into binary Punnett squares. We want to say you are 50% this and 50% that. But the Jewish Filipino discovery showed that you can carry the markers of a group you have no direct social or historical connection to, simply because your ancestors and theirs once survived the same evolutionary bottleneck. This reality is annoying to those who want a simple, easy-peasy version of genetics. It means that the genome cards promised by the 1990s science journalists are effectively useless for defining identity. If a doctor swipes your card and sees a Jewish-associated mutation in a Filipino patient, the Mendelian model says it's an error. The Waddington model, the marble on the landscape, says it's a natural outcome of a complex system. But this discovery revealed a hidden cost. If our genetic code is a shared ancient library rather than a private family diary, then the very concept of genetic purity is not just morally wrong, it is a biological impossibility.
This realization brings us to the most uncomfortable realization in modern genomics. the heritability of traits we once thought were purely cultural. When the initial shock of the shared markers wore off, scientists began to look at polygenic scores. This is the modern replacement for the Punnett square. Instead of looking for one gene for a trait, researchers look at thousands of tiny variations across the entire genome. In both Filipino and Jewish cohorts, researchers noticed a high frequency of specific variants related to hyper-adaptability, the ability of a population to thrive under rapid dietary shifts. For the Jewish diaspora, this was a survival mechanism for life in varying urban environments across Europe and Asia. For the Filipino people, it was a requirement for surviving the volatile ecology of an island chain prone to volcanic eruptions and changing sea levels. The shock wasn't that they were the same people, but that they had developed the same genetic toolkit for resilience. But here is where the science takes a dark turn. When we start identifying resilience genes or intelligence markers in specific groups, we risk sliding back into the dangerous territory of eugenics. In the early 20th century, the misinterpretation of Mendel's work led to the good genes versus bad genes movement. People were categorized as fit or unfit based on simplistic traits. Today, with our advanced sequencing, we run the risk of doing the same thing with big data. If we see a success marker in a certain population, we might be tempted to say that their socioeconomic status is written in their blood. But as the Waddington landscape shows us, a gene is just a peg in the ground. It pulls on a rope, but it doesn't determine where the marble lands. The environment, poverty, education, nutrition, and even the hire dryer of historical trauma can nudge the marble into a different valley entirely. Two people can have the exact same wealth-associated genes, but if one rolls down a landscape of opportunity and the other rolls down a landscape of systemic oppression, their outcomes will be opposites. The genetics of the Jewish and Filipino populations prove this. Despite shared molecular tools, their historical paths were shaped by the landscapes they inhabited. We have to stop asking what our genes code for and start asking what they allow for. Your DNA is not a script that you must follow. It is a range of possibilities. The shock scientists felt wasn't just about the data. It was the realization that we can no longer use biology to justify our social hierarchies. The Jewish-Filipino connection is a reminder that we are a single, sprawling, and incredibly messy species. But this discovery revealed a hidden cost. If we continued to teach the easy-peasy Mendel version of genetics in schools, we are essentially training the next generation to believe in a biological myth. We are giving them the tools to build new walls, rather than the maps to see that the walls never existed. Students who are taught the entangled nature of genes and environment emerge more skeptical of genetic determinism. They realize that a golden gene for riches or a warrior gene for aggression is nonsense. They see that the complexity of the Waddington landscape is what makes us human. But even if we fix the curriculum, there is still one mystery that remains. If these populations are so intertwined at a molecular level, what other genetic mirrors are hiding in plain sight? What if the next shock doesn't come from across an ocean, but from within your own family tree? The story of our DNA is not a closed book of ancestry. It is a living, breathing map of human resilience that is still being drawn. And as we peer deeper into the code, we find that the most exclusive traits we claim for our groups are often the very things that connect us to the people we thought were the most distant. But if the walls of race and ethnicity are crumbling at a molecular level, what happens when we turn that same lens on the very definition of human? As we move beyond the superficial markers of Jewish or Filipino DNA, we encounter the final and perhaps most jarring revelation of the modern genomic era, the shadow genome. For decades, we believed that the 2% of our DNA that codes for proteins
The blueprints for our physical bodies was the only part that mattered. We called the rest junk DNA. But the shocking overlap between these two seemingly unrelated populations exists primarily in that junk DNA. It turns out that this non-coding dark matter is actually the control room of the cell, acting as a massive switchboard that turns genes on or off based on environmental triggers. This is the ultimate evolution of Waddington's metaphor. If the genes are the pegs and the landscape is the surface, then the shadow genome is the set of hands constantly adjusting the tension of the ropes. This explains why two people can share the same ancestry but have entirely different biological lives. It's why a descendant of a Sephardic Jew in Manila and a descendant of an Ashkenazi Jew in New York might share a unique susceptibility to the same rare condition, while their own siblings do not. The shock was never just about the similarity. It was about the discovery that our history is stored in the volume knobs of our DNA, not just the on-off switches. We are now entering an era where we must retire the word ancestry in favor of affinity. Ancestry implies a fixed point in the past, a static origin. Affinity describes a dynamic relationship with the molecular ghosts of our predecessors. The Filipino and Jewish connection serves as a profound case study in this shift. It proves that human populations are not like different brands of cars manufactured in separate factories. We are more like a single, global river that occasionally splits into streams, only to merge again in the most unexpected places.
The Helix horizon isn't a destination we reach by tracing a straight line back to a single ancestor. It's the realization that the further back we look, the more everyone's lines begin to blur and bleed into one another. When we tell the story of Mendel's peas, we are telling a story of isolation and artificial purity. But when we tell the story of the Jewish Filipino genetic mirror, we are telling the true story of humanity, a story of migration, survival, and an incredible hidden interconnectedness that refuses to be categorized. The Mendelism we were taught in school provided a comfortable, orderly view of the world. It allowed us to believe that we could look at a person and know their code. But modern science has taken that comfort away, replacing it with a reality that is far more complex, far more mysterious, and infinitely more beautiful. We are not a collection of discrete tribes. We are a singular, ancient network, carrying the code of lost civilizations and extinct cousins in every cell of our bodies. But as we dismantle these biological barriers and realize that our unique heritage is actually a shared human library, a new question emerges. If our DNA doesn't define our boundaries, what does? And if we can find the Levant in the Pacific, where else have we been hiding the truth of our origins? The discovery of shared molecular ghosts between the Jews and the Filipinos is just the beginning. It forces us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about the very first humans to leave Africa. If these two groups share a secret history, what happens when we look at the populations we've always been told are pure? What if the cradle of civilization wasn't a single point on a map, but a global web of interaction that we are only just beginning to untangle? If you found the hidden links between these two populations startling, you haven't seen the full picture of how ancient migrations are still rewriting the maps of modern medicine, starting with the forbidden history of the people who crossed the Sahul Shelf. In the end, the shock felt by the scientific community wasn't just about a shared sequence of nucleotides or a surprising statistical overlap. It was the final collapse of the blueprint myth. We have spent centuries trying to use biology to justify our divisions, searching for the seed of our differences in the spiral of the double helix. But the more we zoom in, the more those differences dissolve into a shared molecular haze.
The story of Jewish and Filipino DNA is a testament to the fact that we are a species of survivors, navigators, and nomads. We carry the echoes of the same ancient storms and the same ancestral struggles, encoded in a language that ignores the borders we draw on maps. We are not a series of distinct chapters. We are a single, continuous, and incredibly complex narrative. As we stand on the Helix horizon, we realize that our DNA is not a cage that defines who we are. It is a bridge that connects us to everyone we've ever been. The mirror has been shattered, and in its pieces, we finally see the truth. There is no them. There is only a vast, interconnected us rolling down the landscape of time together. But if the connection between the Mediterranean and the Pacific surprised you, it is merely a prelude to a much deeper mystery. What happens when we trace these genetic ghosts even further back to a time when the Earth's geography looked nothing like it does today? To understand the true origin of our resilience, we have to look at the lost continent that still lives inside your immune system.